Henry VII, the first of the Tudor monarchs. I'm going to begin with the Wars of the Roses, which famously ended with Henry VII, and let's just look a little bit back further into history at this man, Edward III, King of England in the 14th century, because he was the paterfamilias, the head of the family from which the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, the two sides that fought in the Wars of the Roses, came from. They both go back to Edward III. Edward was a very powerful leader, and England became one of the strongest countries in Europe during the time of his reign. And he had two sons, John of Gaunt and Edmund, Duke of York, and these two families developed into the House of Lancaster, who were the descendants of John of Gaunt, and the House of York, the descendants of Edmund. And these two were fighting for control of the country, with the Lancastrians initially ruling up until 1461, and then after that the Yorkists. So Henry Tudor, the subject of our talk today, was actually a member of the House of Lancaster, and the rather unpopular Richard III had been killed at the Battle of Bosworth, whereupon Henry married Richard's niece and united the two families, and in this way he took the throne. Well, Richard III is partly unpopular because he is considered to have ordered the murder of his two nephews, one of whom, the elder one, was briefly King of England until Richard came along and usurped him. So that's part of the reason why he's unpopular. He's also shown by Shakespeare and others as a hunchback, which he may or may not have been. Actually, interestingly enough, just 3 years ago, the bones of Richard III were found on the site of an old church. And indeed, he did have a deformity of the spine. It would not have led to a hunchback. It would have led to his right shoulder being raised, as we can see in the following picture. Okay, it seems as if the picture is faithful to the reality of Richard, that he would have had this raised right shoulder. And as I say, his remains were found in what had been a church and was currently a car park in Leicester in 2012. Henry's reign starts with the death of Richard, or indeed, as we shall see, the day before the death of Richard, interestingly enough, and his marriage to Richard's niece. This brought the Wars of the Roses to the end, and it also brought an end to what was called the Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England for hundreds of years, and a new age began. Very much a new age. We can think of the Tudor period as perhaps being the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period, although some people would put the beginning of the early modern period a little bit earlier. In England's case, probably the fact that the Wars of the Roses were going on, it makes it more of a medieval country still at that stage. So how would we talk about the end of the Middle Ages? What would we use as benchmarks to indicate this change? Well, one was the socio-linguistic situation. The society and the language actually were very closely connected in the case of England, because the ruling class had spoken Norman French and the Anglo-Saxons had spoken Old English, or their Middle English. Their English had evolved from the Anglo-Saxon language under Norman influence. But that influence of the French, the Norman French, onto the Anglo-Saxon, and of course the influence of the Anglo-Saxon onto the Norman French, meant that eventually those two languages started to mix together until they reached a point where there wasn't really any appreciable difference. They just became two registers, two levels of the same language, with more educated people using more French and lower classes using more Saxon vocabulary, but basically one language. And of course, the society was not divided in the way that it had been when there were two basic types of Englishmen, the Normans, who were the ruling class speaking one language and the Saxons speaking another. This would be the period of the feudal system, where the Saxons were kept totally under the control of the Normans, and that system had been weakened over the years, and particularly when the Wars of the Roses had weakened the nobility as well, and we start to have a middle class coming up, the merchants and tradesmen too, tradesmen, merchants and craftsmen, and people like this would be forming a kind of small but significant middle class. So we have the language change, we have the society changing its shape, and we also have the cultural flowering of the Renaissance. So what kind of king was Henry? He was not a fighter on the whole, he was not a warrior, although he did basically become king as a result of the Battle of Bosworth Field. I think he was not even present for the battle. He was a clever man in certain ways. He wasn't particularly pleasant, and he found a way to control the lords by declaring that he had been king from the day before the battle in which Richard III was killed, thus making all those who fought for Richard technically traitors. He did promise that if they swore to support him, they would be unpunished, but it was one of the ways that he had of keeping control of the ruling elite, the other nobles. On the whole, though, he was not a man, as I say, of war. He was a man of trading and building up diplomatic agreements. So for the first time, for a long time, Britain really was, or England, I'm sorry, I should say England really was pretty much at peace with her neighbours. And the trading agreements were very important with France and the Netherlands. The agreement with the Netherlands was particularly important because it involved the exporting of wool to the Netherlands, where the wool was made into clothes and then imported back into England. And Henry developed a system of heavy taxation for the export of wool, and also gave incentives to weavers, skilled workers from the Netherlands, to come into England and to set up their trade so that the wool could be processed inside England, keeping a kind of monopoly, a closed trade agreement really. And this is rather contrasting with the way that we think of Britain these days, as being an advocate of free market policies. It was a protectionist market, really, in the sense that Henry was trying to control the wool trade and charge heavy taxes for people who exported the wool. And he also built up the economy by collecting taxes inside the country. The other thing he did that was pretty important was that he created an alliance with Scotland through the marriage of his daughter Margaret to James Stuart. This is going to be very important later on. And also, with his eldest son Arthur marrying the Spanish Prince Catherine of Aragon, we get an alliance with Spain, a rather uneasy one because Arthur died, and that left a bit of a difficult situation. And then he made an alliance with Germany. So in many ways his reign was one of consolidating, setting up agreements, forming alliances, and establishing the country with a stable economy and basically a country that was at peace with its neighbours. What did Henry leave behind him when he died? Well, he left a large personal fortune and a flourishing economy, both of which were depleted by his son, who was very different from the father and took part in quite expensive foreign wars. The marriages that he had engineered were both very important. The marriage to James IV of Scotland gave the Stuart kings of Scotland a claim to the English throne, and that became actuality, that became true when Elizabeth III died childless in 1603. And although Arthur had died shortly after marrying Catherine of Aragon, his brother Henry VIII went on to marry her just after Henry VII's death, after his father's death, and a marriage which had long been planned between Henry and his dead brother's wife went ahead, and they had a child, Mary, who went on to become Queen of England.